Hello and welcome to NARC Live on Wednesday the 4th of May 2022, coming to you live from Norfolk on the east coast of England with Tammy M0TC.
Hello.
And me, David G7URP. Lovely to see you. On tonight's show, we'll find out more about the VNA explained with Alan Wolke W2AEW. We've got a whole brand new type of antenna from Bob G6PWS. And we find out what on earth this is. I must say, we've had another bumper postbag. But were you right? We'll find out. First, I think, that introduction, we said it's May the 4th. And for those of you into a certain type of science fiction, that will mean a lot to you, a lot more to you. And Dodge, M0TTS, sent us this afternoon, for example. May the Morse be with you. No, I think it's...
I think he's got the day wrong.
Yeah, it's May the 4th, isn't it? Not Morse. But anyway, if you're a Morse fan, I'm sure you go along with that. Thanks very much. Now, we start off with a similar thing to what I did do last week when I appealed to you for vote in our AGM and send nominations and things. I must say you didn't let us down. We've had, I think it was 76 people vote in the end for our Speaker of the Year last year. So that's a fantastic effort. Plus we've got a couple of paper votes and email votes as well. So we've included those and we'll be announcing that all at our AGM, our annual general meeting, which is next Wednesday, the 11th of May. And it's in person at CNS School. Now, we hope that many of you will come along to that. It will be run as COVID safe as we can. Just as before, and you'll be able to buy drinks and things like that, cans of drink and soft drinks, or you can bring your own flask if you want a hot drink there. And there'll be plenty of space, windows open, etc. So we hope that many of you will make it. If you can't, we've been actually to the school this afternoon, Tammy and I, and we're going to try and stream from it using the data that we've got. We did a data test and speed test on our phones. And we're going to tether to that, and we're going to try and bring you the AGM from there. It's not a NARC Live, so it won't have all these sort of things at the beginning. And the stream should start round about 7:30 next week. Now, if you're a NARC member, you're very welcome to join that. It is a members-only event, really. But we'll be sending the details of how to watch that on the newsletter. It won't be on Facebook because that makes it very public and we don't think that's appropriate for an AGM. But you will be able to watch probably on BATC, but we've just got to confirm all that with you, and you will get the usual link then in that case to watch it on BATC. We think that's the way we're going to stream it. It won't be a sort of full production because we've got an awful lot to do on the night. But for those of you who can't make it, and we appreciate that some of you also don't feel at the moment that you don't feel you still want to go and mix in groups. So for those of you members, that's why we're doing it. We're going to stream as well. Thanks to Tammy for taking that on, because I'm chairman of the club, of course, so I'll be quite busy chairing the meeting as well that evening. But we hope many of you will join us in person. It starts at 7 o'clock and we're there until 9 o'clock. The AGM itself will start at 7:30. Now, you may, hopefully most of you by now have had an email from us. If you won't, you'll get one this evening with details about voting for a couple of things that you need to do. Now, normally these are things that are done voting in person, but because we're living in a more online world since COVID, we are going to allow voting online. So you'll have got a second voting form for two things that we need to elect. Firstly, we had 3 charities nominated for us. In fact, I think Tammy can show us the screen. Can you? Or not? Maybe you know. Sorry, maybe you can't. I didn't know if we prepared this to show us the screen that you'll be able to link on to vote for certain things. Firstly, there were 9 people. Let me tell you about this. There were 9 people stand for our committee positions, but there are only 8 positions on the committee. So clearly we have an election or a ballot for that. The second thing is that there are 3 charities that were nominated to us by members before the deadline, and these are also on this form. And I think, Tammy, are you going to show us this or not? I'm sorry if I've caught you.
Yeah, you have.
I'm sorry, I thought we were going to do this. To be honest, because we were at the school this afternoon, we're a little bit behind with things, with another rehearsal we had to do earlier as well. Anyway, we're going to try and show that in a minute, but the main thing is it's very, very easy. You do not have to give any personal information other than your name and your call sign. There's no email address or anything like that. And we'll validate all the members because you've given us your call sign. We'll be able to do that from that. So all you've got to do is click on the link. Tammy's going to show you now. This is what it looks like. And you can see there we've got our 9 people who are standing for committee. You need to select up to 8 of them. You can just select 5 or 6, or if you wish, if you only know that number. But you vote no more than 8, please. Otherwise, your vote will be null. And then the second one, you can see that we've got 3 charities nominated there. Cancer Research UK, Combat to Coffee and Nelson's Journey. And because some of those may not be as well known charities as others, we've put links to their whole websites so that you can be well informed before you make that choice. And whichever one gets the most votes will be the charity that's elected for our fundraising efforts for this year. Now, these are important things, and we hope that many of you will take the advantage of voting, and it's a very, very simple form. You just need at the bottom to put your name and your call sign, as you can see at the bottom, and do that, just as you did, over 70 of you did it for us last week. If you are going to be at the AGM, though, there will be a few paper printouts of that form, which I'll do, which you'll need to be there, though, at 7 o'clock dead, to be able to fill your form in and give it to our auditors before 7:15, where they'll be making the count, because the meeting will start at 7:30. The other way, if you really don't want to click on the link for that form, as I said, there's no personal data that you're going to enter to even worry about sharing. But if not, you could either print that out and post it to me if you wish to do it that way, or you can email me with your selection. That's fine, and the usual email address for this program as well. It will only go to me. And also to our auditors. That's everything else about that is confidential. So I hope that's fairly clear what we're doing next week, but it's the AGM, and we hope as many of you will come along as possible, because of course one of the main features of the AGM is the awards, and we'll be presenting lots of awards on the evening.
Can I just say that on both the BATC stream and the Facebook stream, we've now put the link for the voting.
Thank you, Tammy. Yeah, excellent. So if you'll be obviously watching us now live on BATC or Facebook, you can click on that. Please make sure you need to be a NARC member to vote, though. Please, if you aren't a NARC member, we will be validating these and checking, and then we'll have to cancel your vote. But so please do enter that. Choose who you want to run your club in terms of your committee for the next year, and also vote for your charity that you wish the club to adopt for the next year. That's on the AGM. Okay, now a note from Malcolm G3PDH. NARC did extremely well again in the last data contest, with another big win, putting us 38,000 points ahead of its nearest competition, Bristol, who are in second place. Special note and congratulations go to Ray G3XLG, operating under his contest call G3G. I've never heard of that one. That's a good one. With first place in the 100-watt assisted section. Thanks to everyone, though, for taking part. A great performance. That's from Malcolm, our president. And also at that same moment, you may have seen the newsletter last weekend. I'm sorry that we're asking you to interact with us quite a lot at the moment, but there's quite a few things coming up which are important. And the next event on our calendar is the National Field Day / Radioactive, which is normally on the first weekend of June, and it is this year. It's set up on the 3rd, Friday the 3rd of June, and the 4th and the 5th are the operating days, 24 hours contest there. Now, as I've said before, we're not doing a full radioactive this year, not least because it's Jubilee weekend, the Queen's Jubilee. It's a 4-day bank holiday altogether, which is very unusual, Thursday to Sunday. And that is, though, when the NFD is taking place. Now, what's really important, and why I'm talking about this to you now, is if you would like to help us with that event, whether it be operating or setting up or whatever, we really do need your commitment now. I know a lot of you expressed interest earlier on in the year and said that you will, yes, you'd like to take part and like that, but I think all of us would agree that there's quite a lot of celebrations happening for the Jubilee, and if you're a part of that, or your family is part of that, and your partner, etc., you may well find that you can't help us. We don't mind either way, but what we can't do is organise this event and then find we've only got a handful of people to set it up, because that wouldn't be safe, and it also wouldn't be enjoyable for those people. So we're asking for your honesty and your commitment now. If you are interested in helping on NFD, that's both for the CW station, which goes on the air, I believe, at 4 o'clock on the Saturday till 4 o'clock on the Sunday, overnight as well, or the 6 metre station, please let us know. Email Malcolm. The details are on last week's newsletter, and we'll be carrying that story again in this weekend's newsletter. It's really important to let us know soon. Otherwise, we'll go so far down the line of organising all of this, and maybe not enough people to run it. And that's not fair, I think you'd agree, on the committee particularly, who'll be setting up the station here at Great Ellingham. So I hope that makes sense. If you want more details, though, have a look at the newsletter and the website. Now, still on a little bit on contesting, really. Normally, once a month, Tammy and we host for the RSGB Tonight at 8. And this month is on contesting, Pushing the Boundaries by Mark Haynes, M0 DXR. We were just doing a rehearsal with him just about an hour or so ago. So that's this coming Monday at 8 p.m. on the RSGB YouTube channel and BATC stream. If you join us live, of course, you can interact and ask questions and make comments, or it will also be recorded, because you may be busy yourself on that time, and you'll be able to watch a recording of it. That's this Monday, though, live at 8 o'clock, Monday the 9th of May. Now, breathe. So what about these antennas then, Tammy? Bob G6PWS, he sent us these. He says, are these new types of antenna ears? He found this on Amazon, as you can see. You can get everything from Amazon, you know.
You can.
And he likened it to this, which I guess is one of his lovely pictures from his garden.
Lovely, isn't it?
Yeah. What frequency do you reckon then?
Don't know.
Fairly high, I think, because they're quite short ears. Yeah, bandwidth.
Okay.
What do you think? Maybe not 70 sems even. I reckon that's more like, 20 sems, something like that. Anyway.
If you say so.
All right. Now, back to us. And you may remember a few weeks ago when we did our Spring Watch feature. Sorry, Spring View.
Spring View.
Spring View feature. James M0 UK has shared with us pictures from his wonderful cameras in the garden. And we saw one bird nesting. I think, was it then or was it the week after that we saw a bird jealously guarding his nest? And we saw the eggs. Was it last week? I can't remember now.
Yeah, last time I think we showed that there was eggs. It was Sid the squatter.
Sid the squatter.
Sid the squatter.
Yeah.
Well, Sid has now got babies. So here are Sid's babies, which I think were born either yesterday or today.
Oh my goodness.
So they are really, really younglings.
Is that Sid coming in?
Sid's now coming in. Look at them. I think Sid had, I'm right in saying he had, or she
it's
had.
I'm just sorry, Tam, to interrupt. It's
Fourth,
today,
yes, today.
It's today, isn't it?
Yeah,
7:51 this morning, feeding them.
So I think Sid had, I can't remember now whether it was 7 eggs, was it? So there's only 4 babies at the moment, so maybe more to come.
All right, okay. I'll keep him busy. Or her.
It's lovely, isn't it?
It is really nice. Thank you very much for that video, James. We look forward to updates
We
as they
do.
get bigger.
Yep.
There's a lot of birds to fit in that
They're
box.
like our little family, aren't they?
They are. We've adopted them,
kept
kind
an
of,
eye
haven't
on
we?
them.
That's right. That's a brilliant video. Thank you very much for sharing that all with us. Actually, do you mind just opening your mouth a minute?
What?
Just look over there and open your mouth.
Why?
Go on, just trust me. Then just put your head back. I swear I've seen that somewhere before. Breakfast time, maybe. Anyway, what have you been doing? Don't forget to let us know. We always love to hear those stories and things at the beginning of the programme. That will help you. Of course, we won't be here next week for NARC Live, but don't worry. If anything that you send to us before 2 weeks' time, we'll be sharing on the next NARC Live, which will be the week after, which is the 18th of May. And we'll tell you a bit about that in a little while. There's the address on your bottom of your screen now. Now, it's that time for Tammy's little people, from rabbits to birds and to your little people.
Well, it's back to May the 4th today. Because it's got to be a Star Wars theme, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah, like the sweets.
Chocolate TIE Fighters.
Yes.
May the 4th.
Very cool.
I thought that looked cool. And who doesn't love a bit of chocolate, eh?
So what is there not to like, really?
Exactly.
Chocolates and TIE Fighters.
And Star Wars, yeah. So all good.
As we always say, miniature-calendar.com for more of those on that wonderful Japanese website. They create a new picture every day. Thank you for this, Tammy. So as I said, keep us informed what you're doing. We have heard from a lot of you about last week's entry. Now, can we show everybody this, Tammy, for those who maybe weren't here and weren't too sure about this? I thought, well, we would get a few, but we've had a lot of entries again for this. And I must admit, I could tell you, I better not tell you yet what I thought it was, but I wasn't right. Let's put it that way. So let's start on this big list of what people thought this was. So John G0MXN says, I've seen items like this many years ago in grocers. for cutting cheese and lard into portions. Also, I had similar with the wire having teeth on for sawing through small branches for firewood when on military survival courses. Clearly no teeth on this item. So the third use I can think of is for removing pottery items when still wet from the slab they are formed on by cutting under the base of the item to move it for firing in a kiln. Well, there's 3 entries there. Kind of. Do we allow 3 entries? Well, I suppose
Why
we can.
not?
All right.
Paul 20NXL, the mystery object, I'm sure it's a wire saw or a cheese wire, another name in use as a survival thing in a life raft or in a survival pack. Nasty use grot wire by army and gangsters.
Okay.
Shall I read the next one?
I think you're going to have to, because you just scribbled something on here that I don't understand.
Well, Steve G3EVA has put a note on to say he wants to change his entry, and he now thinks...
You can't do that, can you?
He did say originally he thought it was a survival saw, but he now thinks it might be a cheese cutter.
All right. Okay. Well, he did say it's a survival saw. Okay. Bruce G4KZT says, I think this week's object is a cheese cutting wire. P.S. Nothing to do with a sewing machine. Absolutely.
Kevin M0KKM, I think this week's is a survival saw or a camping saw, usually used to cut wood for fires. I guess that at a push, I guess you could use it for a sewing machine.
Sewing machine in half.
Cut a sewing machine in half.
Kevin M0UJD says, I think this week's item is a cheese wire. The ring that's on the end to put your fingers through to pull the wire down through the cheese to cut it.
Paul G3VPT, is this week's a garrote? After school, I had a grocery round delivering on a trade bike from a corner shop, Granville in Norwich. They had one of these on the counter for cutting cheese. Also, a hand-operated bacon slicer and sugar bagged up in the shop. No supermarkets then. Me again. Oh, he obviously sent another email.
He sent me a couple of emails, yeah.
Is it a wire to cut the clay items off a potter's wheel?
Okay, well, I don't know if we should allow all these multiple entries. There's so many people are doing it. Let's do it. Let's go with it. Bob GSDU says, hi, David. This week's object looks like a cheese cutting wire used for dividing big pieces of cheese.
Mark M7LLS, is this week's item a wire saw? Looks like one I have, but I can't make it out from the picture if there are teeth on the wire.
Doug 2E0YWP says, is it a cheese cutter? Probably not. Ha ha.
Tom G8XQD, is that the skeleton of Kermit the Frog?
What? What?
I've seen stuff like it used for cutting the seal to remove a vehicle windscreen. And then he's also put a homemade cheese cutter, a diabolical garrote from the SAS toolkit. So I think he's just covering all bases.
Exactly. Jim G4BDW says, I think this week's mystery object is a wire saw, one used to include in RAF survival packs that formed part of the cushion of an ejection seat, so that in the event that the occupants had to eject from the aircraft, they had a survival pack with them that contained various items to help them survive in a hostile environment.
Nev M0NFY, looks like a cheese wire to me, i.e. a wire for cutting cheese. It could be a garrote, but I hope not.
Yes. John G8VP says, back to reality after a lie down in a darkened room. Actually, he sent me a picture. Oh, that one, Tammy. Can you show this? This is what John actually says.
Just bear with me.
When he saw that picture, sorry about that.
Come off here.
John G8VP sent me this picture to accompany his. When he first saw it, he said, this is what he thought of.
Hang on, where are we? There you go.
That's what John saw. Is there something wrong with him? He says, back to reality after a lockdown in a darkened room. We better show the other picture, Tammy. We'll get loads more people entering. He says it looks like something that a potter would use to remove clay from his potter's wheel.
Tony M0TDK, he thinks this week's looks like a cheese wire, device for cutting cheese, or at least that was its original use. Don't ask me how I know of the other uses. During World War II, similar devices were allegedly used to dispose of enemy sentries. I believe the drill was to creep up behind them with the thing held in each hand, cross your arms and drop it over the sentry head and pull. What? Not very pleasant for either party. Or it could be an illegal rabbit trap.
No, I think that's it. Okay, maybe, we'll see in a minute. Colin G4WTD says, is it a wire saw? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I missed that one. So from Nigel 20NLK, I think this week's What on Earth is a cheese cutter.
Mike GAEUY, I love his turn of phrase here. This week's item is either for use by special forces dispatching an adversary with extreme prejudice, a garrote, or more likely a cheese wire for cutting cheeses. Yeah, because this is not live, we're gentle here.
Colin M0GMK, I think this week's object is a wire saw which can be used to cut several different materials.
And John 2E0TWQ, he's covering all bases as well because he says, well, I've got 3 suggestions for this week. Could it be a clay cutter? Or could it be a cheese cutter? Or could it be a wire garrote?
James M0JGX, is it two key rings and a guitar string? Could be used for cutting cheese. Not saying that's what it is, but it would work.
And Stuart, the last entry, M0JKB, is it a smiley cheese wire? You see, a bit like John was thinking there. I think you need to lie down as well, Stuart. Anyway, if you could see our faces right now, you would see us looking a little bit smug because for the first time for ages...
Got another one there that says, I think it might be a parachute release wire.
Robert GA still says, is it a parachute release wire? Okay. Okay,
and
someone else, Ken, thinks it's a cheese cutter. Anyway, if you could see our faces right now, you'd see that we look a little bit smug because of the last week's windfall or landfall, whatever, with it. We're looking smug because it's none of those things.
It's not. I have to show this picture again first because next to my slide deck. But it is this. So
it's a device to move a screen. Now, this was from Bob G6PWS, and at first all he did was send us the picture of that item that you saw. So just to remind you again what that looks like. Not that one, sorry, that one. All right, but Bob sent us this today. He did this repair on Monday. This is actually an Apple Watch. If you have a look there, I actually didn't say Apple Watch, but it looks like possibly an Apple Watch. Underneath in that special vise, you can see, and you use it to remove a screen. And I had to read out about this. When he sent it with a description of what it did, and I thought, well, that looks like a cheese cut to me. That's what I'd have written. Is that what you would have written?
Yeah.
But this is what it's used for. So it's a kind of a version of that wire, and it's used to remove screens on phones and things like watches. Who would have guessed? None of you.
Nope.
So anyway, well done to all of you for entering to the great spirit of it, but that's what it was. Will you be any better off this time with this week's What on Earth is This? We've shown it in 2 positions there. And when you've seen it, it's brilliant. That's all I can say.
Yep.
We mustn't give any clues because you've got 2 weeks to find out and to email us to say what this gadget does. What on earth is this? You can start emailing us now, and you've got until Wednesday week at 3 p.m. to tell us what you think that is. It's clearly a commercial item. I'm not going to say any more though. It's really good. So thanks once again for all those entries as well. And by the way, if you find any useful gadgets around the house or anything that you've got that you think might fox everybody or amuse them, then you can always send them to us. Just to let you know what's coming on this week before we go to our guest tonight. Sunday at 7 o'clock on the GB Tourist News on GB3MB. On Monday at 7:30, it's the Monday Night Net on GB3MB as well. At 8:30, the 80 metre CW net on 3.543 megahertz. And next Wednesday, the 11th of May, as I said earlier, it's our annual general meeting. It is at the CNS school. We hope lots of you will feel able to come to that. It also will be streamed probably to BATC on a unique link. It won't be on Facebook, I can tell you that. But you'll be able to just pick up this link and run with it. That will come out next weekend when we've done all the technical sides of it. And don't forget to send us all your stories about what you're doing and the news, because it will still be useful in a couple of weeks' time. And also this card, of course, which we sent one of these yesterday to somebody who celebrated an 89th birthday. Are we allowed to say that? Yeah, I think so. It's Victor G6JMB. He celebrated his 89th birthday and we sent him a card. G3, sorry, JMB. And he sent... and we sent a card to him. So we're always happy to send a card. This is one of our Norfolk Amateur Radio Club cards to anybody you feel celebrating something. It just needs a bit of cheering up. Not very well, maybe. We're very happy to send that to him. So now we reach this week's main event. And with us is a guest who's been with us before. First, he was telling us about how to use basic test equipment around the shack. But is here tonight to talk to us about the VNA, or the Nano VNA, which you might have seen. You might even have one. But as if you have one, you'll know they do take quite a bit of understanding in setting up. So who better to tell us about it than Alan W2AEW. Hello, Alan.
Good evening. How are you all?
We're great, thank you. Thanks for staying around for all our What on Earth is This? We should have asked you if you had any idea what it was.
I probably would have said a cheese cutter.
Yeah, I think most of us would say that probably, or a lot of us would, unless we watch gory films. But anyway, thank you very much for coming to us again tonight. We're looking forward to hearing about it. And just a reminder to you, those at home, if you have any questions or comments to put to Alan, if you've got one of these VNAs or you've got a specific question you'd like to ask, then drop it down on BATC or Facebook, and we'll read them to Alan at the end. But now back to Alan for all details all about the VNA.
Alrighty, thank you, David. Thank you, Tammy, and thank you for having me back. And some of you may have seen versions of this talk. I've given this to clubs around the world a couple of times over the last year or two, but happy to kind of go through it here again. And a little bit of updated information, but not a terrible amount of change. But hopefully this will help bring you some understanding. So again, that's me, Alan Wolke, W2AEW. I'm based in East Coast of the United States in New Jersey. So pardon the accent. And I think also pardon the fact that any references that I make to places to purchase the VNA or prices are going to be based on US sources and in US dollars. So I didn't do the conversion factor to pounds. So anyway, here's our agenda tonight here. So first off, why do we want to talk about the VNA and the Nano VNA? Well, the main reason is that these really ridiculously inexpensive, and I say $50 to $60 Nano VNA is probably about the same in pounds, make VNAs accessible now to hobbyists. These are typically tools that were not available to us mere mortals. So first, though, we're going to talk about what a vector network analyzer is, because it's important to kind of understand what it is and what it isn't, to then understand what the Nano VNA brings to the party for us. And then we'll then talk about what a VNA is good for, why you want to use one, and why you might need to use one. And then we'll finally take a look at the Nano VNA itself, because the likelihood is that very few of us will have access to a more professional VNA, and all we're going to have access to are these Nano VNAs. So let's first answer the question, what is a VNA? Now, if we go to our friend Google, and we just ask it what a VNA is, you're going to get an answer something like an instrument that measures the magnitude and phase of the reflection and transmission properties of the ports of a device versus frequency. Well, what the heck is that? I know that doesn't really help you, and it didn't help me when I first read it too. So let's break this down and get a better understanding of what a VNA really is. So here's a couple of physical examples, and there's many, many different commercial units out there. And in general, a VNA is an instrument that's used to characterize RF devices. Okay, that sounds like that's of interest to us as hams. That's good. And again, it used to only be used by professional RF engineers in industry because of the cost. These two units up here are inexpensive VNAs, and they're on the order of $5,000 to $10,000. Okay. Professional units cost sometimes tens of thousands of dollars or more. This very, very high performance 4-channel unit that I showed down here, US list price as of a few months ago, and I checked, it was nearly $250,000. Wow. So the cost of a small house. So likelihood is that none of you are going to have that kind of free cash laying around to get one of these professional VNAs. Now, the other thing you'll find is that a VNA, when you start doing research on how to use them and applications for VNAs, there's a lot of acronyms and terminology. So we need to cover a little bit of that so that when you start looking at references and things like that, you understand what that terminology means. So we'll cover a little bit of that, and then we'll dig into what's inside a VNA. So the first acronym that you'll see is DUT. And DUT stands for device under test. So quite simply. So it could be an antenna system. So it only has maybe an input port. It could be a filter or an amplifier. So it has an input and output port, for example. And any device is going to affect the signal either going through it or the signal being applied to it because of the device characteristics in terms of what it does for the signals passing through. And also at RF, the input impedance to the device will affect some characteristics of the source that's being applied to it. We all remember from our basic electronics is that you get the maximum power transfer when the internal resistance of the source is equal to the resistance of the load. Anytime there's a mismatch, you're not going to get the maximum possible power transfer. That same analogy is true in a more general sense when the RF load is equal to the complex conjugate of the source impedance. Now, we're not going to talk in these complex conjugate terms and these complex impedance terms very much here. I want to kind of get down to some of the more practical aspects of it. But in general, if you're doing any kind of RF design, maybe designing matching networks and things like that, you will start dealing with some complex impedance values. And that's one of the things that the Nano VNA can do for you. So in that case, where you do have an application to measure complex impedance, that's where a VNA will bring more to the party than simply using something like an antenna analyzer. So when we talk about RF, generally it's helpful to think of signals as waves, okay? Rather than in terms of just voltage and current, we think about RF signals as waves, and waves have a magnitude, which is essentially the amplitude of the signal, and a phase. And if you look at this picture up here, you can kind of picture those two topics, right? The darker, larger wave, if you will, has got a larger amplitude than the lighter blue one here. And there also is there's a bit of a delay between the two. And delay is just another way of talking about phase. If you think about a single cycle of a waveform, that's 360 degrees. So we can talk about a delay in terms of degrees or a delay in terms of time. When we talk about it in terms of degrees, it's always going to be relative to frequency. I've also shown this little image right here that graphically shows, say, a source producing, say this blue wave here going out towards a load. And if that load is not properly matched, you can get a reflection off of that load shown as the red waveform coming back. And you can see that the distance between the load and the source, as it varies, will vary the phase of the reflected signal with respect to the incident signal. And this is part of what a VNA will help you measure. So again, if we have a source of some sort, some RF source feeding an input signal to a DUT, okay, what's shown here in the green arrow, depending on the DUT and what it is, you may have some transmission through that device. Again, it could be a filter, it could be just a length of transmission line or coax, could be an amplifier of some sort, but the properties of the transmission properties of that DUT might be important to learn. Similarly, if there is an impedance mismatch at the input port compared to the transmission line, you may get some energy reflected off of the input port and going back to the source. So these are primarily the properties that we're looking at with a VNA. So the device, the DUT reflection and transmission will alter the magnitude and phase of the source signal. Okay, so it'll either be completely absorb the signal or reflect some of it back. But all of that can be characterized by looking at the magnitude and phase of the reflection and transmission with respect to the signal being applied from the source. So this is what a VNA does. And here's a really basic block diagram of a very basic VNA, very similar to the Nano VNA that we're going to talk about. So there is an RF source that's providing the stimulus for our test subject. There are directional couplers. In the case of the Nano VNA, we use a slightly different type of coupler in here, actually a measurement bridge, but the effect is the same. The directional couplers are designed to pick off a sample of the signal being transmitted or sent to the DUT, and that's being picked off here into what we call the R receiver, or reference receiver. And then any energy being reflected off of the input port that didn't get absorbed or passed through the DUT, the reflected energy comes back, and then that will be picked off by the A coupler here. And then there are receivers inside the VNA that measure both the magnitude and phase of these three signals. So one is going to measure essentially as a reference the source that's being applied. So we call that R for reference. And then the A and the B receivers will measure the reflected energy and the transmitted energy from and through the DUT. Again, they are receivers that can measure magnitude and phase. And then there's a little bit of a compute engine that takes those results and from that computes the various parameters that we can get from a VNA. Things like simple properties like a VSWR or return loss or reflection coefficient or transmission coefficient, even complex impedance. Okay, that's all just derived from the measurements from the A, B, and R receivers inside the VNA. So the transmission properties, which are measured essentially on port 2 by the B receiver, they're measurements that are based on this ratio of the B measured result with respect to the reference result. So based on B over R. And this is measuring things like gain or loss. You also measure a S parameter called S21. We'll briefly talk about S parameters here in a moment. Also known as the transmission coefficient. And we can also derive things like the insertion phase or group delay for a DUT. The reflection properties or reflection measurements are measured off of port 1, okay? Just kind of a naming convention here. And those are based on the ratio of the A receiver to the R receiver. And this would be, and the measurements that you can derive from that, again, are VSWR, reflection coefficient, return loss, and input impedance, for example. Now, most professional VNAs will have a set of couplers and a source on port 2 as well. So you can make both forward measurements as well as the reverse measurements without having to reconnect and change the connections. But very inexpensive, cost-efficient VNAs like our Nano VNA are more configured like this. Okay, this is very similar to what is inside the Nano VNA that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. So what is a VNA good for? So if we just look at single port measurements, those measurements off of port 1, for example, the single port measurements are reflection measurements, which is SWR or VSWR of an antenna or antenna system. When I say system, I mean the antenna and its feed line. You can also measure complex impedance, and that could be for a circuit that you're developing. Maybe you're trying to do an impedance match at the input of an amplifier, or you might want to measure complex impedance looking into the coax or transmission line feeding your antenna. You can also use it to measure components, resistors, inductors, capacitors, etc. And it might be helpful to actually measure those values at the frequency you're going to operate them at, because of parasitics and things like that might alter their properties. So you can do that with a VNA. You can also use it to compute feed line length, like a distance to fault measurement, for example. Now, I've colored these a little bit differently because it's yet one more computation on the results, something called a time domain transform that's used for that. But these are what a VNA can do for you. Now, on the 2-port measurements, these are the transmission measurements, the signal that's going through the device under test. And that's, again, filter shape or loss. So if you want to look at the bandpass filter or a low-pass filter and look at its passband response, its stop band rejection, and things like that, you can characterize that. Another example of that is maybe a duplexer that you have on a repeater, to measure how much isolation you're getting from the transmit and receive paths on the duplexer, for example. Now, the Nano VNA falls a little shy of doing a really great job in doing that, but it certainly gets you close. Certainly, you can measure feed loss, or loss, I should say, in a feed line, right? Because in effect, it's if you simply connect that up between the ports of the VNA, if you lose any energy in that feed line, you'll be able to measure that. Delay through a device under test, as we mentioned, and things like amplifier gain and frequency response are other examples. So all this means we can start looking at things like antennas and duplexers and filters and other passive components and active components, even splitters and balance, phasing networks. All these types of things are, things that us as amateur radio operators tend to play with. So it certainly looks like it'll be a useful tool for us. So let's dig in a little bit more with this. Let's talk about that dreaded thing called S parameters. It's one of those things that's a pretty scary thing for most people that have never heard of a VNA before or never used one. S parameters are equally mysterious. And they are called scattering parameters. And again, I know that doesn't help you in terms of what they are. But quite simply, it's a ratio, okay? And just the same ratio that we were talking about. It's a ratio of a measured response to a stimulus. And the colors here mean something. The S just says it's an S parameter. The red, the first number, is the response that's being measured, okay, in response to a stimulus that comes from port number here. So I've got port 1 and port 2. So these numbers that follow the S refer to port 1 and port 2 on the VNA. So S11, for example, refers to essentially the response at port 1 in response to the stimulus being applied from port 1. Gee, that's A over R. That's just what we had talked about earlier. So in terms of how a VNA works. So the S parameter is simply the complex measurement of that, okay, of the reflection properties. And S11 is essentially also called the reflection coefficient, the input reflection coefficient. Again, R being the reference that's being applied. Similarly, S21, okay, is going to be the response through a device. So it's a response measured at port 2 by the B receiver with respect to the reference being applied to port 1. So port 1 provides the reference, so that's what the 1 is. The 2 is the measurement at port 2. So that quite simply is what these S parameters are. Now you could also imagine if you had a source over on port 2, then you could also have S parameters where 2 is the second digit, like S12 and S22, which could be the reverse transmission and reverse reflection properties. Okay, but a Nano VNA doesn't give us that ability. It only gives us a source on one port, so we can only measure these two. If you need to measure the reverse property, you simply take the device out, reverse it, reconnect it, and then measure the other properties. So that's a real great basic lesson of what S parameters are and what they mean. So another complicating factor that people get scared of with VNAs is the concept of calibration. Because most of us have got antenna analyzers and things like that. You know, you take it out of the box, you turn it on, batteries are good, you just hook it up to your antenna, you make your measurements and you're good. I don't have to calibrate anything. Why do I have to calibrate a VNA? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. So number one is a VNA has generally a very large measurement dynamic range. And what I mean by that is it can measure the response of, say, like a filter where that might have, very little insertion loss, so like 0 dB of loss or close to 0 dB of loss, but that might have 60 or 70 dB of rejection on either side of the passband. That's a really large dynamic range, right? 60 dB is a factor of 1,000,000. So any errors that might creep in due to leakage paths and imperfections in the device will affect the ability to measure this very large dynamic range. So part of the user calibration is to remove those systematic errors so that we can get down to this measurement dynamic range, which can be quite good. Another reason is that we're measuring phase. Now, remember what I said about phase a couple of slides ago, is phase is really another way of measuring delay. So if I'm connecting a device up to my VNA, I might be using a short jumper piece of coax or a piece of wire or something to connect up to the device I'm trying to measure. There's going to be some delay associated with the signal going through that interconnect. And we might want to remove that so that it doesn't become part of our measurement, because the delay or the phase of that interconnect is not part of the device of the DUT. So we want to remove that. And the process of doing that is something called establishing a new measurement plane. So by measuring or doing a calibration effectively at the ports of the DUT, you effectively can remove the effects of all the interconnect that you have going up to the DUT. And of course, no factory cal can account for these things, right? There's no way when they build a VNA that they know what you're going to use to connect from the ports of the DUT to your device. So since you can't account for all of these things, we need to run this user calibration to establish that measurement plane, get rid of the phase and attenuation, et cetera, of the interconnects, and get rid of other systematic errors to give us that large dynamic range. That being said, can you get away without doing a calibration? Well, in some cases you certainly can, but in most cases you're going to get better results if you actually run the cal and use it. So when do we do a calibration? Whenever we have some kind of a configuration change. And usually that means one of two things. You're using a different set of cables or adapters or fixtures to get up to the device that you're measuring. And also anytime you change the frequency range that you're measuring over compared to the last time you ran the calibration. These are the two primary reasons why you'd want to rerun a user calibration. So again, the calibration corrects for systematic error sources. And these are things such as tracking errors. Tracking errors refer to the source and receiver frequency responses. They're not going to be perfect. Some magnitude and phase characteristics, or the magnitude and phase response of these amplifiers and measurement receivers are not going to be perfect. The amplitude over frequency of the source isn't going to be perfect. So we measure that and then are able to mathematically remove that from our measurements. Matching errors. For example, the port on the VNA ideally is a perfect 50 ohm port, but it isn't always. And there may be some reflection coming off of that port even before you connect a DUT. So by measuring that, we can also, again, remove that source of error from our measurements. You may have leakage from port 1 to port 2. And that leakage would effectively bypass the DUT. So we want to account for that as well to ensure that any response that we measure on port 2 is only from the DUT. And similarly, we could have directivity issues with our measurement couplers here. Directivity means it's a non-ideal thing about a coupler, where a directional coupler ideally will sample part of the signal going in one direction and not at all from the other direction. But the reality is they do respond from the opposite direction as well. And that's something called the directivity of these couplers. And part of the calibration can measure that, and again, mathematically remove that. And then, of course, we've got the user cables, fixtures, etc., that will help us to establish the measurement plane at the ports of our DUT. Okay, and again, this is generally of importance when we need to know things like the actual complex impedance at our device ports, so we can design a matching network. If you're simply just doing a VSWR measurement or something like that, not as important, but still, so you can do the calibration at the ports of the VNA as opposed to at your DUT, for example. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So when we look at a VNA, there's a lot of different formats, display formats we can have. You see things like Smith charts and SWR plots and things like that. Now, in general, most of the measurements we're making are made with respect to a frequency sweep over a frequency range. And we're looking at things like the reflection coefficient, or S11. The most common way to look at the S11 response over frequency is to plot the log magnitude of it. Remember, these are complex numbers, so they could be represented by some real component, plus or minus some imaginary component, or it can be looked at as the magnitude and some phase value. And if we take that magnitude and convert it as into decibels, as a log magnitude, that's the most common way to look at S11, is the decibel representation of the magnitude of the reflection off of the port. When you're measuring SWR, it's typically a linear plot, okay? So, 1.2 to 1, 3 to 1, etc. When you're measuring complex impedance, the most common way to look at that on a VNA is with the Smith chart. Now, I'm not going to go really deep into a Smith chart in this talk. I do have a whole nother talk that we can do on Smith charts. If there's interest in the future, we could certainly take an intro dive into Smith charts in the future. But it's typically a really convenient way of representing complex impedance and the effects of transmission lines on that complex impedance. Now, the transmission coefficient, this is the signal going through your DUT. Again, that's typically going to be the log mag for the same reasons as the reflection coefficient. And then other measurements such as delay, insertion phase, group delay are typically all linear measurements versus frequency. As I mentioned, there's a transform measurement, which is typically a mathematical transform applied to the reflection properties, and that will result in giving you a measurement versus time instead of versus frequency. That can be converted into being able to look for things like distance to fault or length of a piece of coax, for example. And it will typically use the reflection coefficient as the measurement, but it's helpful to change it from log mag to linear, because the plot will give you a sharper peak as opposed to a bit of a rounded peak in the result, a more precise measurement, just because you got a pointed peak typically by switching to linear. So with all that, that's the very basic understanding of what a VNA is. So let's dig into what the Nano VNA is, okay, and start talking about what it is and how we use it. Now, the ugly truth about the Nano VNA is that there's no one manufacturer of it or no sets of manufacturers of it. The Nano VNA started kind of as an open source project, and effectively China Incorporated got a hold of it, and everybody and their brother started making variants of this Nano VNA. So there's no real true blue in terms of the original Nano VNAs that were out there. The original one is often called a -H because the name of one of the developers was a guy named Hugen, Hugen, and it came out with just a 2.8-inch touchscreen display. Didn't even have a case on it. It was basically just 2 or 3 boards stacked up with a battery and then a metal plate on the top with the connector sticking out the side, but it was just an open design. And later you started seeing folks that made some injection molded cases for them. But they had this really small 2.8-inch display, which was a little bit too small for my eyes. So later, the H4, which is essentially the original design with a 4-inch display, came out. And that's one of the units I have here, and I still use it quite a bit. And performs, pretty well. Certainly for the price, performs amazingly well. But this is a very, very common unit that, even though it's now been available to buy in this format for better than 2 years, it's still not a bad choice to make if you're going to pick up your first Nano VNA. Now, there are a couple of shortcomings with the VNA in general, the Nano VNAs in general, and somebody, one other smart fellow, kind of picked up on the fact that I could do this a little bit better, and he made a version of the Nano VNA that's called the -F. And he put it in a metal case instead of a plastic case, so better shielding, so it has a little bit better measurement dynamic range, and also corrected one big flaw in terms of labeling that I don't understand why it was done. But the Nano VNA folks kind of deviated from the typical and traditional VNA port naming scheme, and instead of calling it port 1 and port 2, they call it channel 0 and channel 1. So, and it's just confusing for anybody who's ever even used a VNA and experienced VNA people. It's like, okay, channel 0 is port 1, channel 1 is port 2. I know that's confusing, but that's the way it is. The guy who developed the -F said, that's ridiculous. I'm going to name them the way they're supposed to be, call them port 1 and port 2. So it's just another one of the little changes that he made. Now later, the folks that developed the original one came out with a version 2. Okay, it's called the SAA2. And it goes up to a little bit higher frequency range. Again, kind of originally offered as just a stack up of boards with a metal plate. And the biggest way to see the difference between the two is that instead of having the connectors come off the side of the display, they come off either top or bottom, depending on your orientation. And they also go up to a higher frequency range, 3 or 4 gigahertz, depending on the model. Now, as of just the last couple of months or so, what's the story here? I still like the H4. It's stable. It's been around a while. It's easy to get. Again, probably more like $70 or $80 now US because of supply chain issues and things like that. But still a pretty decent, well-performing unit, and not so much money that if you dropped it and broke it, you're not going to be completely, you're not being sent to the poorhouse. Okay. Now the SAA2, or the Nano VNA V2, as it's sometimes known, is better performing than the H4. It does have a better dynamic range. It's not terribly fast, but again, it was also initially offered with a 2.8-inch display, but now available with 4-inch displays. And there's also a version called the SAA2N, which has N connectors on it, which are considerably more robust than the SMA connectors that are on the other variants. I have one of these as well. And again, this one was probably 10 or 20% more money than the H4. These same guys developed an improved version, which they did not make open source. So, which is a good thing, meaning that they do have a little bit of control over the design and performance, although people have made clones of this. But there are ways of kind of making sure you get something that was kind of supporting the original guys. And this was called the Nano VNA V2 plus 4, and that's pictured over here. I've got one of these as well. And this one costs initially about twice as much as the H4, but goes up to 4 gigahertz and has a much better dynamic range than the H4 does. Actually is just about good enough to do a pretty decent job in tuning a set of duplexer cans. Okay, still not perfect, but a whole lot better than the H4. Okay, And now we're starting to see a V2+4 Pro, which is some minor hardware upgrades to improve both speed and dynamic range even further. And they're supposedly working on a V3, which actually comes pretty close to commercial specs for a couple of $100. So really not too bad. So there's always things changing kind of in this, because it's not kind of a major manufacturer that's building these things. It's these guys in their garage are coming up with these great things. So a couple more details. All of these VNAs are what we call 2-port, 1-path. And that's kind of the block diagram I showed you. What it means, it has 2 ports on it, right? Port 1 and port 2, but it only can measure one through path, one transmission path. So it's another way of saying it only has a source on one of the ports. Okay, so 2-port, 1-path just means I've got a source behind port 1. I don't have it behind port 2, so I can only measure one through path, as opposed to measuring in the opposite direction. The H4 that I kind of like and kind of favor, if you will, goes to 1.5 gigahertz, which is more than adequate for most of our amateur radio use. All of the Nano VNAs offer standalone operation. They've got a rechargeable battery, and they work really well just in your hand. But there's also PC applications available for them that offer some additional advantages. Excuse me. This includes removing some of the limitations of things like the number of trace points being used, and also being able to not overlay plots on top of each other. So if you really want to learn some more, take a look at nanovna.com. There's a lot of links there to wiki support groups and things like that. You get a lot of good information there. There's a lot of groups.io user groups for the various versions of the Nano VNA as well. And you'll find kind of a menu here available for Nano VNA Saver, which is one of the offline PC applications and that type of thing. There are separate groups for the SAA2, the V2+4, et cetera. And for those folks that have developed the V2+4, again, because it's not an open source thing, they kind of have a bit more control over it. That group is kind of centered at this website here, nanorfe.com, and then nanovna-v2. And I think they probably have other sites that are coming up for the upcoming V3 and things like that. But on this page, you'll find recommended places to purchase them and things like that to ensure you're getting a device that's not a knockoff. So let's look at under the hood. Now, this is under the hood of the H and the H4. The later models, the V2 and things like that, are different, but they all use a similar principle here in terms of keeping things simple and therefore keeping things inexpensive. So in this case, channel 0 and channel 1, which are port 1 and port 2, are kind of shown here. The RF source is a little, I think it's a SPI bus or I2C bus controlled RF synthesizer. And its output is being sent to a measurement bridge, like a Wheatstone bridge. It's kind of like a return loss bridge. That's being used in place of the directional couplers, again, for cost reasons. Okay, and then so that provides the RF source that effectively comes out port 1, channel 0 to our DUT. There are a set of mixers that are used to take not only the signal that's coming back from the reflected energy, but also the through energy, as well as the reference. Okay, those mixers are our old friend, the SA612 or SA602. Low-cost mixers that were developed originally for the cell phone industry and are available very, very dirt cheap. And they'll basically take the RF signal and convert it down to audio. And then those audio signals, audio frequency range signals, are fed into this very inexpensive but pretty complex advanced codec, coder and encoder, or decoder encoder, that's used in commercial, or I should say consumer audio electronics, CD players and things like that. This stereo audio codec, it's got analog to digital converters. It's geared around dealing with audio signals, has a lot of compute capability that's built into it, and it's dirt cheap because it's made by the millions for consumer electronics and consumer audio equipment. So that's why it was included in here. So using these inexpensive, readily available parts, now we've got effectively our source, effectively the directional coupler, our mixers to get down into the compute engine, and then we've got a microcontroller that controls all of that. Talks to the codec, talks to the synthesizer, as well as talks to the LCD display and everything, and provides the user interface. So that's really quite simply what's inside, in this case, the H and the H4. A little bit of a different structure for the F and the later V2 models, but fundamentally, they're following the same kind of a concept. Now, the other thing I'll mention here, and we'll talk about it a little bit later on, is that this RF synthesizer does not put out a sine wave. The output of it is a square wave. So the test signal going to your device is a square wave. And we'll talk about the implications of that in a little bit. So let's talk about the user interface for the Nano VNA, because they're all pretty common. The early, most of the H's, the H4s, and things like that generally have this little jog wheel. It has a little rocker wheel that you can rock back and forth to move things back and forth on the screen or up and down on the screen, and you can push on it to make selections. The later models, the V2s, replace that jog wheel with 3 push buttons. The center push button is like pushing on the jog wheel, and the other 2 are kind of the same as rocking it back and forth. Okay, but at the end of the day, it's 3 momentary push buttons. The screen is a touch screen. Not multi-touch, but like you can't do pinch and zoom, but you can touch on it to make selections. You can touch and slide to move markers around and that type of a thing. But you could also do those things with the jog wheel and things like that if you don't like touching the screen. And the menu structure, while not intuitive, is not really that complex. It's just not the most intuitive thing to use. There's a home menu that starts off with showing display and marker and stimulus, etc. And then each of those displays will work your way down into sub-menus to select things like what traces you want to have open, which channels those traces are making measurements from, what format they're taking, and then similar functions for markers, setting up your stimulus frequency range, etc. But really not that hard. We'll go through some of this. When you do a user calibration, there are save slots, meaning little memory that's allocated to that. When you finish a calibration, you can save that result of that calibration in this little memory slot, so that if you go to repeat a measurement under the same conditions later on, you don't have to repeat the calibration. You can just load up that saved calibration state. They all generally have a USB port on them. That's both for charging the battery as well as interfacing with the PC to use the offline software, or even doing firmware updates. So let's talk about the calibration process again. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the initial versions of the Nano VNA only put 101 points across the sweep. And so whether you're looking at, in this case, from 400 to 450 megahertz, you basically only had 101 points between those 2 start and stop frequencies. And that's important because when you're doing the calibration is only done at those particular measurement points. So if you ran a calibration that, in this case, covers 50 megahertz, right, that's enough of a span that would cover the entire HF band. You might find that the spacing between those points might go completely, around a particular measurement band that you want to measure. For example, on the HF frequency band, if you measure from 2 to 30 megahertz with 100 points, you might only get 1 or 2 points that land somewhere within our HF bands that we can use, and you're not going to get a very good calibration, for that. So now I put an asterisk here because there are later versions of firmware that do increase the number of measurement points, but it's generally to 2 to 400. That still could be fairly coarse depending on what frequency range you're measuring over. Now, if you measured over a wide frequency range, or did a calibration, I should say, over a wide frequency range, and then reset your measurement frequency range to a narrower range, you may only have a couple of points in that range that are actually calibrated. And the Nano VNA will generally interpolate between those points. And whether that interpolation is valid or not really depends on how wide that spacing is and if you've got any narrowband things going on. So most will do that interpolation, but it's, again, always a good idea to calibrate over the specific measurement range that you're measuring in that instance. So it's always a good idea to go do that. So again, later versions of firmware, as a developer that I've used, that is probably one of the more popular developers of firmware. His username is dislord, and his firmware is one of the ones that increased the number of measurement points to about 400 or so. So on the Nano VNA itself, if you have one, you may have noticed these indications on the left-hand margin of the plot, and these are your calibration indications. And the way to read this is this. The first letter C just stands for calibration. If that letter C is capitalized, it means that you are currently calibrated over the frequency range that you're measuring right now. Okay, so you're good to go. The number, and then if it's a small letter C, it means that you have a calibration that's covering the frequency range, but not at the same point, meaning it's going to be doing some interpolation between its measured calibration points and where you're actually making your measurements currently. So it's a good idea to repeat the calibration and turn that little C into a big one. The number following that is the slot in which that calibration is currently stored, just to get as a reminder. So you can look at it and say, oh, I remember I used slot number 3 for my 40-meter antenna, right? Okay, the next numbers, D, R, and S, stand for the directivity, reflection, and source error corrections. We talked about those systematic errors. These are 3 of those sources of systematic errors. This is saying that we've done a calibration that's sufficient to apply the correction factors for the directivity of the coupler, in this case the measurement bridge, reflection tracking, and source matching. These again are all calibrations associated with port 1 or channel 0, the reflection port. The last 2 are calibrations that are associated with the transmission properties. And this would be crosstalk between the 2 ports, as well as transmission tracking of the measurement receiver on port 1. Again, these are measurements these are important when you're making measurements on channel 1, where you're making a 2-port measurement. These 3 are required for all measurements, whether you're making reflection measurements or transmission property measurements. You need to have these calibrations done. These last 2, which are really done by doing an isolation and through measurement, are only necessary if you're making transmission measurements. If you're just measuring VSWR of an antenna, you really don't have to do that last calibration step that takes care of these error corrections. So let's look at the process, okay? And this kind of walks you through a little bit of the way the user interface works. So we start with the main menu, menu here, and we select Cal. You'll click on Cal, and then you get the calibration menu. Next thing we want to do is hit the reset button. The reset will clear out the current calibration and get you ready to run a new cal. So once you hit reset, you're still on the same menu. You can touch on calibrate. Once you do that, then it's going to prompt you to attach the various what are called calibration standards to the device or at the point where your DOT connects. And there's basically an open, short, and a load, OSL, okay? You connect the open, which just looks like, in this case, an SMA termination cap with nothing in the middle of it. It's literally just an open circuit, okay? And then you touch on open, you connect it, touch on open, it makes the sweep with that. Then you attach the short, touch on short, and then it makes the measurement on that one. Do the same thing for the 50 ohm load. So that will take care of those first 3 channel 0 calibrations. Again, they're required for all measurements. And then the isolation and through measurements are where we actually apply a termination to channel 1 to keep it from receiving stray energy, and therefore we can measure the crosstalk between port 1 and port 2 inside the VNA. And then the through measurement is connecting the 2 ports together, okay, so we can measure the source, for example, okay, and apply those corrections. So once you've done all of these, then you hit done. And when you hit done, it'll prompt you to save the calibration into the desired slot. 0 through 4. Later firmware versions actually have more slots. Okay. The other, one thing important to remember is that whatever calibration is stored in slot number 0, that gets recalled when you power up the device. So that's kind of your default calibration, is whatever is stored in port 0. And ideally, you'd want to connect all of these cal standards to where your device connects. And that's, as I mentioned before, to establish that measurement plane at your device interconnect point. Okay. Now, sometimes that's just not possible. Okay. And if it's not possible, one thing you can do is do something called a port extension. So let's say I've got my device, but it's not possible for me to connect my cal standard at the end of this cable, right? For whatever reason, because of adapters or something like that. And again, this doesn't always matter. It only matters at higher frequencies generally, you know, when you get up into, you know, up into well up into the UHF frequency range, et cetera. But it's just something I'll just mention here. So when it's not possible to do that, you can run a calibration at the end of whatever you can get to, as close as you can get to the device, and then apply something called a port extension, okay, to account for the additional phase and delay with the additional connection that you weren't able to calibrate out, okay? So again, this is when you must use some kind of an adapter or coax or fixture, you know, maybe to connect up to your DUT, because your DUT might be at the end of a transmission, a trace on a circuit board, right? So the port extension can be used to remove that. And the Nano VNA calls this port extension function the electrical delay adjustment. And you can adjust this by applying a open or a short at the DUT location, because oftentimes you can do that. Let's say I was trying to measure the impedance at a printed circuit board antenna, and there's a transmission line on the board that I can't remove. I could basically just momentarily put a short where the antenna is, okay, and make a measurement, or cut the trace on a test board to do an open. And then you can actually use the Smith chart. And again, a little beyond what we're going to go into in this talk, but you can use the Smith chart to adjust the electrical delay until you indicate a perfect open or a perfect short, and therefore accounting for that extra delay and moving the reference plane to your actual device. Again, only important when you're generally operating at very high frequencies and where you need an accurate phase measurement at the DUT. Like if you're going to design a matching network to solder down to the circuit board at a PCB antenna, for example. Okay. Or if you may want to use this same function to remove the transmission line that's going up to your antenna, so you can design a matching network that you're going to mount at the antenna up on the tower. Okay. But you can make these measurements, you know, down at on the ground, and then knowing the length of the coax, you can then extrapolate what the impedance is at your antenna, and therefore design your matching network for that. All right, so let's get into the practicalities of things here. So again, the Nano VNA has 2 channels, right? They call it channel 0, channel 1. We call them port 1 and port 2, and then a number of different traces. You can have up to 4 traces turned on at any point in time. So the channels, again, are channel 0, which is port 1 for making all your reflection measurements. Channel 1 is your transmission, okay, where you're making your through measurements, okay, S21, gain, loss, etc. And then for each of those channels, you can decide what traces you want to apply or be used for those channels. You could, if you want to, you only want to measure SWR, you could turn off all the traces except one of them, tell that one trace to look at channel 0, and then everything else is ignored and not put on the screen. Okay. So you pick pick a trace that once you select the trace kind of shows up in inverse text, tell it which channel you want that trace to be applied to. Okay. So you set that up first, and then you go, okay, what trace formats do I want to have? I've got my traces set up. Okay. Again, my channel 0, if I'm measuring the S11, that's typically going to be a log mag. If I'm measuring complex impedance, I'll use Smith. If I'm measuring SWR, that's going to be a linear. Same thing for channel 1, the log mag for the through measurements, and then some linear measurements for insertion phase. But you under display, you select the trace and tell it what format you want that trace to be. Okay. There are a lot of other formats that, unless you're an RF designer, you probably won't care about. So I'm trying to talk just about the things that us as hams will typically worry about. So once you've got the traces selected, the channels you want to measure, the measurements you want to make, Then you set to tell the Nano VNA what measurement frequency range you want to measure. And the Nano VNA gives you two ways of defining this. You can select the start and stop frequency. I want to start at 7 meg to 7.3 meg. That's usually easier to use when you're measuring over a given amateur radio band, for example. Or you can set the center frequency and the span. And this sometimes is helpful if you're measuring the response of like a bandpass filter. So the center frequency is going to be X, and then I want to measure so far around either side of that. Sometimes it might be easier for you to think about it one way or the other. It doesn't really matter which one you use. Any combination of these 4 buttons will effectively allow you to set the frequency range you're making the measurements over. There's also the ability to set the unit up to measure just at a single frequency. You might want to make a measurement of SWR or measure a component at one single frequency, and that's what lets you do that. So once you've got those set up and you're making your measurements, there are markers that will help you to extract values from the traces, okay? And there are up to 4 markers available. The markers can be moved around either by touching and dragging them on the screen or using the jog wheel. And there's also a delta marker that can measure the difference in value from one marker to another one. So the selected marker is kind of shown here. In this case, the selected marker is marker number 2. So if we look here, say for channel 0, log mag of S11, that's this yellow trace, that's yellow here. And I can see where marker 2 is right now, okay, which is right there. That's measuring minus 8.19 dB, okay. And if we look, for example, at this light blue trace down here, here's marker 2 right here. That's this blue trace here, that's the SWR plot. And we can see that marker value is at 2.27. So that the SWR at that point, at that frequency, is 2.27 to 1, okay? So that's how you read that. And then this other curve trace here is the Smith chart plot that's using the circular axes. So again, the delta is from this is measuring the delta in frequency between those 2 markers, between marker 1 and marker 2. All the markers track each other. So if I move a marker across on this plot here, it's going to move to the same frequency on all the other plots as well. There are search features to allow you to search for mins and maxes. Okay, so if you want to find the minimum SWR or minimum return loss, et cetera, you can do that. And there's also operations that allow you to use the markers to set things like the center frequency or the stop and start frequency. Okay, so you can say, well, I want to measure over this frequency range here. You can move the markers around that point and tell it to do that. And you could also set the values that are used in the Smith chart. In this case, it's set to actual component values like resistance, in this case, capacitance. Okay. So here's the basic setup process if you're going to use your Nano VNA. Now that we know what it is. You first configure the traces, what channels they're on, what formats are being used for the measurements. And again, it could be as simple as one trace measuring SWR, and that's it. Or it could be a combination of multiple traces. So once you get that configured, you set up the stimulus. What frequency range do I want to make the measurements over? And the reality is each of these measurements can be made. You can do that in either order. You can do the stimulus first and then configure the traces, or vice versa. It doesn't really matter. But once you get that all defined, that's when you run the calibration. Okay. In fact, once the stimulus is defined, you can run the calibration. You can even change traces and channels and formats later as well. But once the stimulus is set, that's when you're going to do a calibrate and save. And then once you're calibrated, now you go ahead and connect your DUT and make your measurements. You can use markers to pull out values at particular frequencies and things like that. And you could even, again, adjust the traces, turn other traces on or off, change the formats, etc. The calibration will all still apply, okay, because you're not changing the stimulus or the way you're connecting to your DUT. So a simple example of what it looks like to measure an antenna, right? I set my frequency range, in this case, from 7 to 7.3 meg over the 40 meter band. I was looking at my dipole antenna here. So that's just connected up through my coax. Now, the reality is I'm measuring the impedance that I'm seeing looking into the coax, right? It's not necessarily the same impedance that we'll see at the antenna, but it's going to be the same SWR. And I'll condition that by saying that if your transmission line is not a radiating part of your antenna and does not determine, and the antenna isn't relying on a specific length of coax to perform properly. And that's the way, generally the way you're going to have is that then the coax length will not affect SWR. It will affect input impedance, but it won't affect SWR. So in this case, I'm showing the SWR plot right here, and you can kind of match up, the color of that trace. You can see that's on channel 0. It's SWR. And right now, the only marker I have is marker 1. And unfortunately, I left the marker when I took this picture at 7 megahertz. So my SWR way down that end of the band is 4.73 to 1. So this curve right here is the complex impedance on the Smith chart. This curve here is the reflection coefficient, or log magnitude of S11. Now, of course, you'll notice that that comes down to a minimum at the same point as the SWR minimum. And what also kind of points out is that sometimes measuring the reflection coefficient, log mag of reflection coefficient, will make it easier to see where your lowest reflection is, okay? So sometimes the SWR plots get kind of shallow, and sometimes it's tough to see, well, where's my minimum actually lying, right? The log mag of S11 is generally pointier and makes it for a more precise measurement of that particular frequency. And of course, you could use the marker search functions to search for that minimum value. So here's an example of measuring a filter. When I made this measurement, it was a low-pass filter that I had designed to stick it on the output of a low-power Michigan Mighty Mite CW transmitter at 3.58 megahertz. So I wanted to reject the harmonics being generated from that. So we can see here's my frequency range from 1 to 15 megahertz. So 1 megahertz down here, 15 megahertz over here. My operating frequency is about 3.58 megahertz, like right in here. So this plot right here is the channel 1 log mag. So that's the S21, okay, or transmission coefficient. And I can see I'm near 0 dB up here, okay, in the passband. And then I can see that I start attenuating and attenuating. We go higher and higher in frequency. This marker 1 is sitting at about 10.52 megahertz. So that's about the third harmonic. And this is telling me that my third harmonic ideally will be rejected by about 47 dB, okay, compared to the passband. I'm also showing the SWR plot. That's this kind of purpley trace here. Now, what's interesting is we can see that in the passband, the SWR is well under 2 to 1. It's about 1.5 to 1 or so throughout that range. And then once you go past the corner of the filter, the SWR rockets up. So that's kind of telling me how this filter works, right? Is that in the passband, it represents a low SWR, so it lets all that energy go through the filter. As you get higher and higher in frequency past the corner, the input reflection gets higher and higher. So we don't even let the energy into the filter. It gets reflected back out. So this is a reflecting type of filter as opposed to an absorbing type filter. So all the energy that we don't want to transmit, we're just reflecting back. Okay. So that's how that filter works. You can see that in the SWR plot. And I'm also plotting the reflection coefficient again, which is just another representation of the reflection properties. And we can kind of see that going on here as well. And I've also got the complex impedance shown here. I didn't really need to keep that on there, but I just neglected to take it off when I took the picture. So here's an example of measuring coax length. This is using that transform that I mentioned. So I've got coax just hanging out there with an open end. And what it's doing is sweeping frequency and measuring the reflected energy coming back. And then from that can derive the length of the coax. That's what the time transform does. So, and you can actually tell the instrument what the velocity factor is for the coax so that it can actually, in the marker value, report it back in distance. In this case, it was about a 9.1 meter long piece of coax that I had connected up here. And again, using channel 0 but linear gives me this nice sharp peak here. If I had left that at log mag, this would be a little bit more of a rounded type of a shape. It's easier to pick out that peak when it's a linear measurement. Now, if we connect up the other end of the coax, if you have access to it, to the other port, and then turn the transform off and just measure S21, now I can measure the loss of that frequency versus time. So a couple of ways to use this to measure coax. So those are some of the real common things that we'll do as amateurs with the Nano VNA. But now we talked about all the really good things about the Nano VNA. It's time to, with all apologies to Clint Eastwood, talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly about the Nano VNA. What are some of the limitations and downsides? So again, early units, initial firmware, probably only 101 trace points. The external software helps with this one, as does later third-party firmware that increases the number of trace points. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, the output is a square wave. Certainly on the H and the H4 it is. Actually on all of them, that uses, even the V2s use effectively a square wave output. When you get up to the higher frequencies, like 3 or 4 gigahertz, it's nearly sinusoidal because those devices don't have enough bandwidth to support the harmonics for that. But in a sense, it's still a square wave output. So in the case of the H4, though, it uses the fact that a square wave has energy at odd harmonics to actually make measurements. So when you're making measurements from up to 300 megahertz, it's using the fundamental frequency. So this is showing the square wave output. This is the spectral content of it. So there's energy at the fundamental, energy at the third harmonic, energy at the fifth harmonic. So the H and the H4 will use the energy at the fundamental to measure the responses. But when you get above 300 meg up to 900 meg, it's actually using the energy in the third harmonic. And from 900 to 1500 megahertz is using the fifth harmonic. So you have to think about, well, what device am I measuring? And is it going to have a problem with the fact that I'm hitting it with a square wave, right? In fact, if you look at this square wave, look at the frequency here, it says 200 megahertz. So this 200 megahertz output square wave is the signal that's going to be used when we're measuring at 200 megahertz. It's the same exact signal that's used when we're measuring at 600 megahertz. It's also the same exact signal that's used when measuring at 1 gig, because it's using the third and fifth harmonic. So you have to think about the device you're measuring and whether it's going to like being hit with a square wave or not. Okay. And also to remember is that in general, the output power, the output amplitude of this is not adjustable. On some models, there is some small amount of adjustability, but it's not over a very wide range. So if you're looking at characterizing an IF amplifier that you're designing for a receiver, for example, you might have to attenuate the output so you don't overdrive the input of that amplifier. And for the H4, again, the measurements I made from 50 kilohertz to 300 meg, that fundamental is at about 0 dBm or about a milliwatt. Okay, and it's about a 600 millivolt peak-to-peak signal. And then the third harmonic is about 10 dB down from that. And then the fifth harmonic is about another 10 to 12 dB down from that. Okay, again, not really adjustable. So again, is that power level appropriate for what you're trying to measure? And is the fact that if I'm trying to measure something at 900 megahertz, that there's also going to be a significant amount of energy at these other frequencies as well because it's being hit by the square wave. So again, is that correct for the device you're measuring? So, and are not going to go into any gain compression or have other problems due to the fact that that's what the test signal is. Also, the receive level into port 2 or channel 1 of the Nano VNA is not adjustable. So if you're measuring an amplifier that's got 20 dB of gain, you might need to attenuate that back down so you don't overdrive the input of the Nano VNA. And they generally have a limited dynamic range compared to the professional units. The H and H4 are in the neighborhood of 40 to 45 dB dynamic range. At lower frequencies, a little bit better. At higher frequencies, a little bit worse. The V2s are better, get up to closer to 60 or 70 dB dynamic range or a little bit better. The resolution bandwidth, okay, that you're making the measurements over is not adjustable. That affects the noise floor. And again, some third-party firmware addresses this, not entirely, but does help to address this. And there may be other limitations as well. They're not really that rugged. I'd much rather bring my rig expert up on a tower than the Nano VNA. And the displays on them are not really very readable in direct sunlight. So they'll get washed out pretty easily. So there's a couple of other little limitations like that. But hey, for the price, you can't really complain, right? So the summary of this is that I guess when I put this together, I called it the RF tool or toy of the year. In reality, and it's been now the tool or toy of the last 2 or 3 years. An amazing capability for typically under $100. And there's a ton of videos out there, not only on my YouTube channel, but on many, many others that show you how to do specific measurements and run through more detailed tutorials on things. A lot of active user groups where you can get good information and things like that. The good US source for some of these units was R&L Electronics. But you may have better sources in the UK than we've got here. So with that, if there's any questions, I don't know if anything popped up in the chat. I got my shameless plug here for my YouTube channel. I've got nearly 170,000 subscribers and over 20 million views. And I do have a pretty good playlist on the Nano VNA itself. So it might be something to go take a look at as well. So
Thank
David,
yeah,
Tammy, we'll send it back to you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Wow, that's a journey, because I don't know if most of you, I guess, or many of you will have seen these things. They're available on Amazon and eBay, typically in this country, I think, and about the 50 or 60 pounds, so similar as Alan said. And they look really tempting, and if you're like me and you like your gadgets and things that look and feel cool, and it really does feel that money worth when you get it. But as Alan's shown tonight, there is a little bit more to using them. They don't just switch on and go. So we're looking for your questions and comments. We've got a few already, but if you've got any for us now, for Alan, before he goes, then this is the time to put them onto BATC or onto Facebook, and we'll read them to him. So first up, Alan, thank you for what you've done so far. Robert GASDU says, does it display forward and reverse at the same time on the screen?
It does for the 2-port 1-path, meaning that it'll measure the reflection off of the input port and the transmission through the other port at the same time. It won't remeasure the reverse direction at the same time. So you can get S11 and S21 at the same time. So yes.
Okay, that's good. I guess that Bob hasn't got one yet. He's got a second part to his question as well. How do you remove the Smith chart while doing filter adjustments?
Oh, if you want to remove it, if you go to the traces and the one trace that's assigned to the Smith chart, just turn it off. Because you can have up to 4 traces turned on, but you can turn any one of them off as well. So you only have to have, if you only want to have 1 trace or 2 traces, so just turn off the trace that is currently set up as a Smith trace.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm sure that's going to help, Bob, if you haven't got one already, Bob. I was going to ask you, I've got a few questions myself, but do ask at home, please, very, very quickly, so that we don't lose Alan first. When you get it, what is the first thing you do? It is calibrate it, I guess?
Well, I always turn it on. Maybe the first thing you got to do is charge the battery, because it may not be fully charged when you get it. When you first turn it on, it's going to have a default calibration that's loaded in channel 0. And typically on most of the ones that I picked up, it went from like 50 kilohertz to 900 meg. So really kind of unusable, because calibration wouldn't apply to a more narrow band measurement. So what I would do is to start learning about it. Say, imagine yourself, I want to measure my 80 meter antenna. So just figure out how to go in and set the stimulus to that, and then go into the calibration menu and familiarize yourself with the use of the little calibration standards and how to connect them up to the port of the device when it asks you for it. And just to validate to yourself that you can actually make these measurements or make these calibrations and make it work. And the way you can tell that is once you finish the calibration, and you say you're measuring an SWR, put that 50 ohm load on there. And that SWR should be flat across the whole frequency band, because it should correct for that and make it perfectly flat. So this will give you some validation that the calibration was right, I did the right thing to it, and then you could hook it up to your antenna and go take a look at it. So
all being that they're quite a lot cheaper, could they be described as a poor man's MFJ 259269 or Rig Expert?
Probably more so, yeah, because both of those devices, the Rig Expert does have the ability of showing the polar plot, or they call it a polar plot, but that's a Smith chart. It can show the complex impedance, it can show reflection coefficient, but one at a time. So the VNA can do that at the same time if you want to overlap the plots on top of each other. It'll generally have more measurement dynamic range than the Rig Expert. Okay. but again, it's because the rig expert will generally rely on just that factory calibration. The rig expert, by the way, does give you the option to do your own open load and short calibration, and you can consider it as a one-port VNA, essentially. The MFJ 259, because it doesn't have the graphical display, you can get the numeric results as you manually sweep frequency. But the thing about the Nano VNA, or excuse me, the MFJ 259 is that it will show you complex impedance, but it won't show you the sign of the reactive component. It can't tell you whether the impedance is inductive or capacitive. Okay, because of the way it makes the measurements. The Nano VNA can do that.
Yeah, good. So good for analysis. We've got some lively comments from people. Chris G4CCX says, very interesting talk. Maybe I can use mine now, thanks. Which I figured would be fairly typical. I must admit. Is it something that can you use one of these as a poor man's spectrum analyzer? I guess as well. I guess you can.
Yeah, well, kind of. The problem is that you have very little adjustability because it's always going to try to provide a source. So what you would probably do if you want to use it as a very poor man's spectrum analyzer is tell it to measure the through measurement, like an S21, and then you connect whatever you want to test to port 2, which is channel 1, and then any energy that comes in from that, will be measured kind of like a spectrum analyzer. The problem is you don't have any adjustability of amplitude. Okay, and you have no adjustability on resolution bandwidth. So that really places some severe limits on what you can do with it, as opposed to a regular spectrum analyzer, or even the Tiny SA, which the Tiny SA is a spectrum analyzer that is in the same form factor as the Nano VNAs, and also about the same price. So you're better off with something like that, as opposed to trying to use the Nano VNA as a spectrum analyzer.
Yeah. I must admit, I've got the spectrum analyzer version, but I haven't bought an Nano VNA, mainly because it just did look like a complex bit of equipment. And I'm a reasonable engineer, although I used to be called a DC engineer because of my RF knowledge. But, this has really helped. I've seen 2 of your talks now on this, and I can tell you that it really does help people. In fact, Pete Evans here, it says, if I get one with no particular use in mind, so it's a piece of general test equipment, is it just a useless piece of kit going to be that, or will I be using it for all kinds of jobs? And thank you very much for the introductory talk, he said.
Well, it really depends on what you've got. I mean, I use mine mostly for looking at antennas. In fact, one of the things I like using it for is, I've got a very small piece of property here, so my antenna is very much of a compromise. It's a center fed doublet fed with open wire line down to a quick balun and into a wide range L network tuner transmatch. So what I'll do is, if ever I got to reset the antenna or whatever, I'll put the Nano VNA in the spot where my transmitter would go, and then I'll adjust my tuner and watch the response on the VNA itself, especially watching the Smith chart. Really helpful, I found, to optimize the tuner, and then make myself a little table of all my tuner settings for a given frequency range. So it puts out such a low power, it's not going to interfere with anything. And so that's one way I use mine quite a bit. I'll also use it when I'm designing RF circuits, or I want to characterize, is this inductor going to work well enough at 10 megahertz as opposed to 1 megahertz. I'll be able to measure it, build a little fixture and measure it, on my device. So it really depends on what you're doing. But it gives you yet one more tool in the toolbox.
Sure. And so if you do spend a bit of time getting to know it and realize what it can do, I guess it is a very useful bit of kit for the money to put in your box. They're not much more, let's face it, than a reasonable multimeter.
Exactly, right, yeah.
So a couple more things for you. Roger G3LDI says, frustrating using it with poor eyes. Maybe you've got the 2.8-inch version, Roger, so maybe it's worth investing in the 4-inch. But, as he does say, but a great instrument and a great talk. So he's Roger who booked you for this talk.
Yeah, like I said, I never went for the 2.8-inch display because I already knew it was going to be too small. The 4-inch one is actually quite usable, I found. I still will use my reading glasses though. But then if you do have a nearby, a laptop computer or tablet, you can use the external software like this Nano VNA Saver, and that will give you the full resolution of the screen. But also, it does a couple of things. It will remove that limitation of the number of trace points because you can set up the sweep to do let's do 10 segments over this frequency range. So it'll apply that 101 points over each of those segments. So you can get much finer resolution. And you can also separate all the plots out into separate plot windows. Instead of having the SWR plot and the Smith chart and everything laying on top of each other, they'll be set up as separate displays. So it kind of gets away from the confusing, very cluttered looking display if you have multiple measurements turned on.
Good advice. Thank you, Alan. Bob GSU has come back and said, can he make a spectrum analyzer work as a VNA? Do you know? You can
generally make a spectrum analyzer work as a scalar network analyzer. Okay, VNA stands for vector network analyzer, and the difference is that the vector name means that we're measuring phase. When you do a measurement with a spectrum analyzer, and oftentimes you'll do it with a spectrum analyzer and something called a tracking generator that goes along with it. The tracking generator will send out a signal and the spectrum analyzer will measure it, but it only measures the magnitude of the response. It does not measure phase. So you can't measure things like complex impedance, but you can measure things like transmission gain and loss in terms of just the magnitude of that. If you don't have the tracking generator, what you can also do sometimes is have a broadband noise source that you apply to the input of your device, and then use the spectrum analyzer at the output, and then you'll be able to see how much noise at different frequencies gets through. So in a sense, that's kind of like a transmission measurement on a network analyzer as well. But the measurements are scalar, meaning magnitude only and not phase.
Lovely. Thank you ever so much. I mean, these aren't complex terms for, even though many of our amateurs now watching will have done our full advance license, which is pretty tough, I think you'd agree. It's still, that doesn't explain to you how these sort of instruments can do wonderful things for you. But just to tell you that Roger G3LDI has come back and says, I do have the 4-inch one with an exclamation mark several times after it. So, okay, Roger, either one of those
reading glasses.
I was going to say either one of those magnifiers, or maybe, as you've said, though, seriously, that you suggest you can get that, did you say VNA Saver software? That means you can plot it on a full-size computer.
Right. So the H and the H4, the most popular software package is called Nano VNA Saver. For the V2, like this is the V2 plus 4 here, there's another popular package called Nano VNA-QT, Quebec Tango. But they'll basically take the measurements from that and plot them on your computer screen.
Lovely. Jim, a final comment. Jim G3AEW says a super talk, another thing added to his birthday list, says Jim. And also, James M0JGX says, thank you. I've been a YouTube subscriber to you, Alan, for some time. So
great.
Lovely.
Thank
and
you.
Lots of other complimentary comments and things. I can't read them all to you. But thank you ever so much for this evening. It really is useful. And I will warn you, as at home now, like most things that you get like this, they're incredible bits of kit. But if it's anything like the spectrum analyzer I bought, you get no instructions with it, not even as much to switch it on, let alone how to use it. So I'm sure that Alan's talk tonight, which we'll be recording and obviously putting on YouTube as well, will be useful to you if you're thinking of buying one of these things. You might need to look back at this when you get it, because I think it will help you use it. Alan, once again, it's been lovely to meet you, and thank you very much for giving us a talk tonight. Thank you very much to Alan, W2AEW.
Oh, you're welcome. And I'll mention on my YouTube channel, I do have a playlist that is just exclusively for the Nano VNA videos. And I've got specific videos on just on calibration. I've got one just on measuring an antenna, just on measuring a filter. So I'll go into more detail, the setup, and walking you through it in those individual videos.
If you're interested to really go back to that, Tammy, could we just quickly show Alan's shot now? Is that all right? I'm sorry to do this. We have... Tammy does a lot more than it looks like to make us double picture-in-picture like this, but we can now show, there we are, there's your YouTube channel there. So it's youtube.com/W2AEW, your call sign.
Or scan a little QR code, that'll get you there too.
Lovely. All right, we'll leave that on there for a moment. But once again, Alan, thank you very much. You've been with us nearly for 2 hours now, so thank you very much for a very long evening for you. And I know it's in the afternoon. You're going to get back to your work now.
I got to get back to real work now.
Absolutely. But once again, thank you very much to Alan, W2AEW.
All right. Take care now.
Take care. Bye-bye. There we are. Now you know.
Yep.
I've had my birthday just a few weeks ago, so make a note. All right. That's almost it then for NARC Live for this week. We look forward to seeing lots of you, hopefully, next week, of course, at the CNS School for the AGM. Remember, 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock. Very important if you want to vote there, though, with a paper vote. There will just be a few sheets available, but you will need to get there for 7 o'clock because we'll be closing the votes for the paper votes at 7:15 so that they can be counted to be used in the AGM, which starts at 7:30. And we will be streaming this to those of you who can't make or don't feel you'd rather not make the AGM, and we'll be streaming it probably to BATC, but look out at the weekend's newsletter for full details. So apart from that, just to let you know again, Sunday night is the GB2RS News at 7 o'clock on GB3MB, also on GB3MB at 7:30 on Monday night. It's a Monday night net. Roger's slapped my wrist and said it's actually not an 80 metre CW net this coming Monday because it's an 80 metre SSB contest. So if you're a contester in the club and give us some more points, we've got to keep that for good position. You'll be doing that. And then, of course, next Wednesday, as I said, it will be the AGM at CNS School. Thank you once again for everything tonight and for joining us. We will see you on NARC Live in 2 weeks' time. But until then, from Tammy, M0TC.
Goodbye.
And from me, David, U7UP. Take care of yourselves. Look after yourself. Bye-bye.